6 o'clock in London, it's 2 p.m. in New York, 3 a.m. in Hong Kong, 5 a.m. in Sydney, 11 a.m. in San Francisco, and 23:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and well, depending on where you are in the world, greetings and welcome. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO video live stream series 5, episode 1. This is number 25, ladies and gentlemen, starts here. It was a week when reality was biting for many. On their Refinitiv honeymoon, the London Stock Exchange Group investors are finally beginning to realise what they could have learnt in Exchange Invest the day this dire deal was first floated. As the Financial Times itself intoned, David Schwimmer, the chief executive, and Don Robert, the chairman, have little experience of merger integration. Let's face it, this merger was a heady mix of fantasy with little application of logic from the day it was born. It's the M&A equivalent of Kristen Wiig's latest movie, Barb and Star Go to Vista Del Mar, albeit without the jokes or Jimmy Dornan. It's a heady mix of Floridian beachside fantasy and precious little grounding in reality. Meanwhile, out of 18,500 Refinitiv employees, that's a headcount of 23,000 at the London Stock Exchange Group in totality, they couldn't find a new head for FTSE Russell indices without engaging a recruitment consultant to find an outside candidate. Clearly, London Stock Exchange Group are keeping a ruthless handle on expenses. Speaking of FTSE Russell, they have been nudging China towards further opening of the stock market to further investors. Until last week, only 25% of Chinese stocks' investable market capital was currently added to the FTSE Global indices. That's now changing, of course, because otherwise that left China deeply unrepresented in the benchmarks. Meanwhile, rumours abound that as a gesture of thanks for their efforts on expanding Chinese stock exchange inclusion, the story on the street is that Beijing has provided a Chairman Mao-era organogram to serve as a template for the new LSEG Refinitiv management structure. Over in Africa, the Zimbabwe Independent notes that the hype that permeated Zimbabwe's capital markets during the build-up to the launch of the Victoria Falls exchange 6 months ago is slowly dissipating as targeted investors keep their distance. Now, there's a financial conundrum for you, ladies and gentlemen. Before the Victoria Falls Exchange was launched, there was, in Zimbabwe, rampant hyperinflation, and the government was forcibly delisting some stocks of foreign owners. Now, call me old-fashioned, and we might even get a chance to talk to our guest about that in a moment. I'm not convinced that amounts to a financial centre's best practice. Over in the USA, its direct public offering postponed as Coinbase has put off its listing in the wake of paying a $6.5 million fine to US authorities for, those sorts of traffic light infringement stuff when you're running an orderly regulated market, like reporting misleading transaction data that potentially inflates the apparent total trading volume on your professional platform. Those kinds of little trifling things. So they're going to put the IPO off until we've all forgotten about it, which apparently in crypto land means April. Anyway, in final news this week, apparently smoking has gone up during the course of COVID-19. Wasn't it obvious that allowing people to work from home means they don't need to go down the fire escape for a cigarette? All this and more, ladies and gentlemen, has been covered in greater detail in Exchange Invest Daily, the unique newsletter of the Bourse business. Ping us an email or hit me up on social media, Patrick L. Young, whichever stream you're watching this on, and we'll get you signed up to Understanding the Exchange Business. A 30-day free trial awaits you. So, tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about the sustainable city and beyond. And therefore, because we're looking to be very hyper-sustainable this evening, please send us a little love, a little like, if you'd be so kind, on social media, wherever you're watching this, so that our search engine optimization can go roaring. And therefore, we can give our august guest the sort of search engine optimization of which he truly deserves. For ladies and gentlemen, the sheriff is in our midst, the sheriff of the City of London, the aldermanic sheriff, no less, Professor Michael Mainelli. He's a Harvard and Trinity College Dublin qualified accountant and, well, polymath. It would take too long to manage to go through his many achievements, but he worked for Deutsche Morgan Grenfell. He co-founded the City of London think tank, ZM, which he continues to run this day, and they are, of course, renowned for their many indices, the global finance being Global financial centre being a particularly important one, smart centres is another, and of course, various variations on a theme of green finance, sustainable city indeed. He is an Emeritus Professor and Life Fellow of Gresham College, which therefore dovetails neatly, of course, with that fascinating discussion we had with the City United project Chairman Daniel Hodson just a couple of weeks ago, who's also, not only he was the Master Mercer, indeed, he was too the Gresham College Professor. Michael has been a past master of the Worshipful company of world traders. Full disclosure, I am honoured to be actually a member of that company and a liveryman to boot. And Michael is, as I said, currently an Alderman and the Sheriff of the City of London for an unprecedented 2-year period. Hashtag COVID-19. So, ladies and gentlemen, the sustainable city and beyond we're looking towards. Michael, where are you in the world today? Good evening.
Well, Patrick, always good to be with you. I'm afraid I'm here in Wapping, sort of just on the outskirts of the City of London, for those who don't know London well, to the southeast, and over one balcony I see the city in all of its glorious emptiness. And over the other balcony, we have a lot of balconies here. I see the gloriousness of an empty Canary Wharf. And yet, amidst an absolutely thriving south of England technology and financial services cluster that's having a boom year. And I think that'll be an interesting thing to chat about.
Absolutely fascinating. And I can see we're already into city trivia this evening. We've got a slightly flippant question. Well, maybe not if he's up for murder. Christopher Messina, who was the first guest on this show many shows ago, is already asking some trivial information, which I'm sure is going to allow you to dive back into history. So, Michael, does the sheriff know the rights of a convicted murderer in the City of London when the convicted is a freeman of the city versus when not?
Well, Chris clearly knows his history, and the answer is that you can be hung by a silken cord. And the reason for that is, were you to use coarse hemp, you might do the dance and take a very long time to die. But with a silken cord, it slips nicely and cracks your neck, and you die swiftly. Not the best of things, but it is in fact, Chris, we have a number of macabre elements to the role of sheriff. We are responsible for the defense of the city, and so when we have the items on the London Bridge, you know, we're technically in some way officers in charge. In the olden days, of course, we were responsible for horrible things in terms of justice, like pressings and women who would bleed the belly and all sorts of horrible things. It is absolutely disgusting when you think what we were like as a people up until perhaps only a century ago, and some might say even more recent than that, until the abolition of the death penalty. And even now, I can't exactly claim that our prison system is a particularly humane place to be, but we are hoping to do a lot of work on that.
Fascinating altogether. So I've got to say, I mean, the luster of being the Sheriff of the City of London, it does sound incredibly romantic and interesting. Tell us a little bit about the history of the whole organization that you stepped into.
Yeah, well, the sad bit is it is a real lesson in history, so I'll try and make it brief. Basically, when the Romans left Britain in 420, the city itself was actually abandoned, and archaeological evidence says that everybody was settled on the west side of the Fleet. But around 600, people began to creep back into the city. I think it was probably a bit like a science fiction film set. You had all these ruined temples and moss overgrowing and all that. They began to set up a whole variety of churches. At one point, the city had about 130 churches. These solidified into about 25 wards, and these wards had beadles. And I think that around 640, the beadles became a bit of a tyrant. They were, you were the person who said, "Where's the curfew?" And I would say, "Well, you know, why is it, Patrick, that the beadle is really nice to you?" And you'd say, "Well, that's because I give him a bottle of beer, Michael." And the citizens got together and began electing 2 sheriffs. I believe that was based on the Roman model of 2 people elected for a year, both of them therefore having to come out when the other came out. And that began roughly around 640. By about 700, we're pretty clear on this. What distinguishes the sheriffs in the City of London is that they're not appointed by the sovereign or the Queen. They are elected by the citizenry. And they were elected by the citizenry all the way up until 1067, when the deal was struck with William I. And from 1067 to 1132, the king appointed the sheriffs. But in 1132, the population got that right back. And so we are arguably the oldest elected position, certainly the oldest secular position in the United Kingdom, and possibly even across Europe in terms of continuity. I know of no other thing that dates back nearly 1400 years.
Well, that's a wonderful history lesson altogether. It's quite incredible. I'm laughing because I found it joyous when you mentioned these things about City of London history, Michael, and you're going, oh, well, of course, I mean, the electors had the right to do that all the way up to 1067 AD. I mean, it brings us right back to the way I ended the show with Daniel the other week, noting about, when it came to the millennial party of 2001 AD, that the Corporation of London was the only financial centre on earth, looking into the archives to see what they did last millennium. It's an incredible history.
It is amazing, and in fact, we were given an unprecedented extra year, as you mentioned, as was the Lord Mayor in a way. But really, of course, the Lord Mayor needed to be re-elected. We were reappointed, and we have a post called the Remembrancer. Many people find that quaint. Personally, I must say, I find it more of a strategy role. When I used to work in the oil sector back in the 70s and 80s, I would frequently encounter these Texans who would be telling me about what it had been like 40 or 50 years ago, either in the Middle East or the initial rounds of the opening of the North Sea. And I used to scratch my head. These were these sort of old Texan roughnecks, and they were really, really into their history. They all worked in the strategy department. And I've begun to realize that strategy departments tend to have an historical view equal to the future view of their installed assets. And so these guys were in those days looking at large-scale oil developments, looking at over 50 to 75 years, and therefore they looked back 50 to 75 years. In our case, the Remembrancer does and did in the past year spend time looking all the way back to William I. We have 3 treaties with the city of substance, so that's the Treaty of 1067, Treaty of 1132, and the Treaty of 1215, which you would know as the Magna Carta. There's several other codicils and treaties involved in it. But as you move forward, the role is actually still the same. There are 3 primary functions. Responsible for defense, I mentioned. We're responsible for justice, which is obvious, and we're running as amateurs the central criminal courts and the Old Bailey, as you know it. But before you laugh, and I do find this funny, people go, why do you put 2 amateurs in charge? I go, well, that's the way it's been running for 1400 years. But people do look up to British justice, and within British justice, they look up to the Old Bailey as possibly the best court in the land. So you've got that. And then the final thing, of course, is taxation. We have a very vestigial tax roll these days, 1 ceremonial and 1 actual, which is signing off the accounts. In the old days, that's why we were particularly hated. It wasn't because of justice, it was because we administered the taxes. And amidst all of that, our job is to support the Lord Mayor, the civic team, and the City of London Corporation in promoting business, technical, professional, and financial services around the world.
Fascinating. And the questions are already stacking up, Michael. You've got some fascinating input already. Thank you very much, Chris Messina, for that lovely insight that Floridians are objecting to any part of the LSE Refinitiv crowd being compared to the lovely beaches of Vista Del Mar or anywhere else. Good point. I was thinking more about the fantasy level of the content of that movie rather than a beach-like comparison. City beaches not being a big thing in the City of London so far, although who knows, I mean, maybe we could ask the sheriff, we might be able to get one this summer. Now we've got, thank you very much, Marion Madeira. I noticed you just liked our show on Facebook. We really appreciate that. Here's a super question coming in from Chris Pryor-Williard. Chris, it's lovely to see you again this evening. Michael, the city got to being a leading financial centre through taking risks and innovating. There is a view that the type of self-regulation and the corporate culture that comes from it has done the opposite of rewarding successful risk-taking and innovative behaviour. How do we recreate a mercantile city?
Well, Chris, always good to hear from you, and I know that you've got a fantastic view of the history as well. I personally, just picking your question apart here slightly, I do think one of the great mistakes was to lose the self-regulatory organizations, personally. The idea there was that we had a group of independent organizations regulating their markets, and we moved that into a unitary regulator. From that point on, I completely agree with you. The application of regulation and the sort of corporate culture has really done the opposite of rewarding successful risk-taking. How do we recreate a mercantile city? Well, it is more than just regulation. I mean, the first is we do have a tremendous number of oligopolies in financial services and in the city. We have 4 accounting firms, we've got 3 credit rating agencies, a limited number of actuarial firms, and then we could get into banking. And certainly since the financial crisis, we've had fewer banks. We started off with about 15 global investment banks of substance, well, the largest ones anyway, in 2008-9. We're now down to a dozen. So we've seen actually a lack of risk taking in that regard. Secondly, we seem to have fallen into this unitary regulator idea, and the difficulty with that is nobody's snitching on anybody else. Everybody says, if I can get away with it to the regulator, then and he's gotten away with it, then I might as well do the same thing. When in the old days, what used to happen was people would call you in and say, you're queering our market, you're not making our market efficient. And this, I think, leads to my fundamental point. Financial services has failed to say sorry for the financial crisis since 2007. We have not bound ourselves into proving to people around the planet what we can actually do to help. Now, the planet has actually come up with some pretty solid goals. Climate change is tops on many people's lists. There's 17 sustainable development goals. And we should, in my opinion, be able to say, this is where finance can help, this is where finance can help, this is where finance can help. And that's how we prove our relevance. Society has so many ways of solving problems. Yeah. Regulation, taxation, standards, command and control, send the army in. It's interesting that during this crisis, to do with COVID, largely financial services have been bypassed, and in many cases haven't covered themselves with glory. I'm thinking in particular of business interruption insurance. So we've got to recreate it. And one of the reasons I'm keen on it is we have a moral responsibility as people who believe in free markets to say to society, you could use many of these mechanisms, but this problem is ideal for financial services. Let us at it. And we had a good go at that, I think, with the carbon trading in '97. And unfortunately, that's been let down, but I'd like to see even that come back. We need to prove our relevance to what society cares about and work back from that.
I think you make a great point there, because certainly the lack of ability, particularly in the banking industry, amongst others, to say sorry. And certainly it's fascinating you headline the fact of, yes, insurance businesses suddenly saying, oh, there must be a loophole here so we don't have to pay for these unprecedented policies are absolutely scandalous. I will put in my 0.02 Satoshi's worth for the parish of exchanges there. I do think the parish of exchanges has worked incredibly well during the course of the last year. There have been downfalls, there have been moments of different outages, but that's one business where the city has been incredibly successful. And certainly the City of London has had next to no downtime as a result of incredible volumes going through, which is great. But you hit the nail on the head. I mean, financial industry overall certainly needs to demonstrate some degree of penitence, because I think in this world we're in, it's a totally different world. So, I mean, that gets us to a very interesting issue, because the future of financial centres is one about which lots of people opine, but I mean, it has to be said, I'm not too sure that many people really actually are more than speaking with authority, but wrongly, the old Swabber principle. You've run this Global Financial Centres Index for, good grief now, what, 20 years? And I mean, we've been meeting at financial centres conferences like Ken's fantastic Global Financial Centres Conference and so on for a decade or more, talking about these issues. What do you really think is the future of financial centres as we sit here today?
Well, I might remind people. Yeah, so we began doing our research into what became the index in 2003. In 2005, we quietly launched the index. We were determined to make sure it was good, and we spent nearly 2 years doing that. And we published for the first time in March 2007. I think what I'd like to point out before we begin to look at the future is just to look at that past. I would point to many viewers, the prevailing theory about how you created a global financial center prior to our index was really on up into 2000 was you started off with a big economy and then a financial center grew on top of it. This, I think, was predicated on a false reading of history. London became a financial center when it was, frankly, a bywater in Europe. London was 30,000 people in 1565. This is a Daniel Hodson again in the Royal Exchange. When the Royal Exchange was founded, Antwerp was about 100,000. But what drove people to London was war. The Dutch rather sillily picked a fight with the Spanish, and everything fled to this London entrepot where Sir Thomas Gresham had cannily basically prepared the ground by copying the Antwerp Bourse. So it wasn't that the UK was a great place to do business. It was that it was the only place to do business where you were treated fairly as a foreigner. So that was the first bit. Then we saw, of course, the rise of the Industrial Revolution, which I think is what has queered people's notions of how a financial center goes. London does become a great financial center. And then, of course, the United States grows and New York becomes a great financial center. And therefore, it's very obvious what the next great financial center was going to be if you study that period. And that was Tokyo. And that was the prevailing, if you go back and look at the literature in the 80s and 90s, Tokyo was guaranteed to be because there was a large domestic economy. And that's not the case at all. And we see today, as we began our study years ago, we had 46 in our first survey in 2007. We now have 114. There's been a plethora of growth there. And so that's the first element I'd point out. Second one, very obvious, is Asia. When I began saying to people, I've been doing some straight lining, and this was in 2007 off of our 2005 data, I was already saying, you can see Asia's going to be absolutely enormous here. And now, of course, 6 of the top 10 centers are Asia. And people in Europe have still not grasped that this is the changing world. Your clients are largely Asian if you're trying to be a global financial center. So there've been a lot of changes in that regard. And I think I need to baseline that before we look forward, if that's okay, Patrick.
Go.
Yeah. So looking forward, I think there's tremendous change. And a lot of it is, has been said by so many commentators, the pandemic has accelerated trends that were already there. One of the trends that I don't think people have grasped is the drop in business travel. Believe it or not, the drop in business travel, I know it's been pretty dramatic in 2020, but it dropped 8% in Scandinavia in 2019, just due to flight shaming. So a social trend had dropped business air travel by 8%. That's an astonishing number. It only dropped 4% when they had the volcano in 2010. So you can see that was a big change. Of course, people were already working 1 and 2 and 3 days from home anyhow. So what we've seen is the acceleration of that in video conferencing. And that has hit 2 industries which were merging anyway, which is finance and tech. The two are becoming closer and closer. And you're beginning to see that the firms that have done the most radical shifts are, of course, finance and tech firms. In our survey, we looked at talking to just 135 leaders of financial services firms, and 85% of them want more home working if that's possible. They actually want more. They're loving it. What the staff think is a slightly different thing. The second thing I think you see is the combination of that is leading you to wonder, what is a financial center? The old geographical bit, I've been looking now for 12 months at an empty city, and yet things are booming. So does somebody who works for Barclays in France work here in London? Are they working in France? We're really starting to care much more where the salaries are going than where the physical location is. And I believe that we're going to see a lot more changes in the way that we do this type of analysis as we go forward. Certainly my team are struggling. We've been doing a tremendous amount of deep data probing on what does commuter intensity mean? How sensitive are cities to commuter intensity? And a lot of these questions haven't been asked in the past, and cities have taken a bit of a direct hit to the biggest thing that makes them successful, which is the power laws. The intensity of interaction in a city has suddenly become a negative. Now, when that comes back, people are still going to remember that was a major risk.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, that power of networking, the intensity of the City of London, it's something which, showed through for us very quickly in terms of publishing Exchange Invest. It was fascinating because when COVID came in, lockdown came in, we thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be a crisis. Quite the opposite. We actually saw our subscriptions going up. Why? Because people no longer had somebody to meet on the platform for the train on a cold morning in Essex or wherever that was, and then they went to, from there or Connecticut into the center of town, and they met other people. They got the subway or the underground or the tube or whatever it was. They met someone else. They were reading all the way along there. Then they were coming out the other side and they were going to a coffee shop where they were picking up a coffee and hearing lots of gossip. And actually, it's in that coffee shop thing, I think, that there's an incredible nexus of power. And in certain ways, I don't know, I always think that maybe the coffee shop almost never went away as the epicenter of power, because when you start to look at it, and I know this is something you're very interested in as well from your own angle, but that nexus of networking is something that's really key to the financial center, which people don't broadly understand when they just throw up 5 or 6 new towers somewhere in an emerging market and decide that's your financial center.
Yeah. Well, one related to yours, I remember being on a call last April with Deputy Governor of Bank of Japan, and I made a remark, and I was surprised he took it so seriously. We had a deeper conversation about it, and that remark was, I expected to see a boom in professional services exports, simply because we've seen a norm change that I can now tell you over a video conference, and I believe that's going to have some enduring bit as well. And the numbers are bolstering that. We're beginning to see a lot more cross-border exchange of professional services, because this is becoming more acceptable. But it does lead you, as you're looking at it, to think, well, what is the global coffee house mean? We're beginning to see what this technology is not so good at. People who talk to me and say to me it works, I find a bit silly. I mean, this stuff's been working for 25 years. My tiny firm Zen put video conferencing in back in 96, I think, maybe 97. Skype is 2003. Jitsi, which I would recommend your viewers look at, JITSI, which is the open source version of video conferencing. Why are we using all of these services like Zoom, etc., is also 2003. You then got Zoom, which everybody's quite keen on, as well as 2011. And of course, if it's 2017 and Microsoft have discovered it, you know it's old technology, which is when they introduced Teams. So you're looking at, it's not that it works, it's that behavior changes when everybody uses it. You know, so it's almost like saying the telephone works. Well, yeah, but if everybody has a telephone, that changes the way that the telephone is valued. As we're looking at it, though, we're seeing what it doesn't do. And I think the biggest thing, and you and I love this, Patrick, it's the buzz. You know, how do I detect the buzz? Where's the buzz? Because the buzz doesn't come here. Things are fixed. So that's one area. A lot of people talk about staff management. Well, grow up. It's time to manage by achievement, not by attendance. And I do think a lot of people, there are challenges there, but they're challenges we should be overcoming in the same way we're overcoming challenges with remote education and things. There are ways through that. But we're missing the buzz, and I don't know how we handle that. So my pitch really here in London has been take that trend, which is a reduction in air travel. That doesn't mean you can't grab a greater market share, particularly if there's going to be fewer trips all around. So I'm anticipating potentially the idea that a workcation might be the norm. People who are normally road warriors. Funny enough, I was on the phone this morning to somebody from Frankfurt who was bragging that in the year before lockdown, he had done 84 air trips. Well, that's insane. You know, so why doesn't he do 2 trips? Go to Singapore for a week, go to London for a week. And if everybody's sort of in the neighborhood, he meets them. And I could see, believe it or not, some of the less commuting into the city of London leaves more space in the city for that type of interaction. I've certainly spoken with some property developers. That's one of the great things about being sheriff. You really care about your estate, walk the bounds. One of the things that property developers have been telling me is that they absolutely intend to build. We've had as many, slightly more planning applications in the last year in the City of London than we had in the previous year, believe it or not. But they're all looking at how they change the way that they develop their estate. They're conscious that their tenants, one, there going to be more of them because people are going to be taking smaller sizes, so that's obvious. Secondly, that the tenants are going to be much more demanding because there's going to be competition out there. How much do I need if the norm is no space? And if my competitors aren't taking space, I darn well better be getting something for this. It's not just a place to park the people. And the third thing is that they're not going to want the staff, for example, might want to go up once a fortnight or something just to meet their colleagues. But why do I want to go into London, take the whole commute thing to meet the 8 or 9 people I Zoom with every day anyway? Okay, I go up and I say hi. But what I want to do is I want to go home and say, hey, honey, that was amazing. Yeah, I saw the 8 or 9 people I work with every day. But what was astonishing is I met 15 new people from all over the world. That's the type of global coffee house we need to create.
Now, that global coffee house idea, I think, is fascinating. And actually, we've got a great question coming from Chris Pryor-Williard in just a moment, which is going to be interesting. I'm going to take also, there's another fabulous comment, very pithy, from Chris Messina, which I'm going to address in a minute. But ladies and gentlemen, we're almost halfway through the show. If you've got a question for the Alderman Sheriff of the City of London, Professor Michael Mainelli, now's your chance to ask him about the world of financial centres and the sustainable city and beyond in particular. Also, please don't forget to like us on social media. It always helps us as we're going along producing this sort of material, because let's face it, what are we doing here on a Tuesday evening? We're trying to add that buzz to the world of financial centres that Michael is concerned about, and rightly so. So we had a fascinating comment there from Chris Messina. It's a bit of an epic. It's going to go over our chin level as we look at it. The global financial industry did nothing to cause the crash of 2007, 2008. That was purely the result of 40 plus years of terrible US government housing policy and distortions driven by people like Andrew Cuomo and Bill Clinton interfering in US domestic mortgage markets. The city has nothing to apologise for. You know what? That may well be right, and we're not going to get on to discussing it today, as I'm sure you don't expect us to, Chris. But I think the problem is maybe when all the banks got bailed out, it might have been quite nice if they demonstrated just a modicum of hubris for at least, like, you know, an ultra low latency trade would have been a start. I think that might be the problem we're coming to. Michael, what do you think?
Well, Chris, I hate to disabuse you. I mean, there's a lot of blame to go around. And personally, you must remember that, in fact, UK domestic banks were leveraged at 42 to 1. May I repeat that? 42 to 1 in 2008. They were going down anyway. If you look at the three countries that had retail financial crises, which put the system systemically at risk, there were three: Ireland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, all characterized by intense concentration. 86% of retail banking in Britain controlled by then 5 firms. Iceland 3 and Ireland 2.5. So I do believe it was there. Then we could, if we wish to spread the blame, we of course got AIG, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, which you're referring to there. We certainly have a number of other areas, but I don't think that the financial industry can just kind of walk away from this and say it was isolated. How Gordon Brown ever got away? Oh, it was an unprecedented global crisis. Well, locally, we allowed our banks to get completely out of control on their lending ratios. And I think it would have gone down anyway, regardless. You're riding a unicycle 42 stories high. You hit any kind of a pebble, you're gonna have a bad tumble. So I do think that the city had something to apologize for. Of course, making apologies, a dozen years later is kind of a bit like apologizing for the Indians or apologizing for the slave trade. It gets you into some funny waters. But there was an opportunity for the city. And I think the opportunity might come again, believe it or not, out of areas like central bank digital currencies. Central bank digital currencies are going to cause a big debate about what is fractional reserve banking.
Yep.
I've never had a discussion about what's the role of credit in a modern economy. And 2009-10 was an ideal opportunity for banks to say, yeah, we're slightly at fault, but you did let us go up at 42 to 1 because you did want to see a boom. You did want an economic boom. You accepted the boom and bust, believe it or not, by allowing that sort of credit creation. Well, what do you really want, society? And I think we're going to have that in spades, because central bank digital currencies are going to call into question, why do banks get these special rights? I never really understood this before. And I personally think it's going to be an interesting period ahead. And we as a financial services industry possibly would have been better prepared for that if we said sorry. In the way that other industries, for example, the mining industry, the plastics industry, have done the usual thing, which is to say, sorry, okay, what do you propose that we do? Here's our response, and then go off and do it.
And I think that's a very good moment where I'm going to plug my book, Victory or Death, actually, because that's precisely discussing the issues of things like central bank digital currency, the future of Bitcoin blockchain, and the future of the financial world. Now, we've got a great question coming in. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Chris, for your comment. Always appreciated. Great to have a debate on the show. Chris Pryor-Williard, once again, good evening, Chris. Brexit is now seen as a challenge to normal market behaviour. Is there something in historic treaties like the Hanseatic League that could be usefully reviewed? What a question, Michael.
What a great question, Chris. I owe you one on that one. Chris, I think, is aware that it's one of my little pet subject areas is the history of the Hanseatic League. So the Hanseatic League begins in the 13th century in Lübeck in Germany and spreads. Historians debate it. Some would say 70 cities were involved. Others would say 110, 120. So it kind of depends. London was not a Hanseatic city, although King's Lynn was. But London had for 400 years. what is today Cannon Street, an area in the city, believe it or not, given to the Hanseatic League by the king, where Londoners were not allowed to tread. In fact, they had a very famous phrase, a shibboleth, bread and cheese. And if you couldn't say that properly in Low German, you weren't allowed in. So it was quite an isolated spot. I'm not saying we want to replicate that. What could we do, though? What were the big lessons from the Hanseatic League? Well, the first was recognizing that cities are what matter. The second was opening free trade amongst all of those cities, making sure that people had rights to trade and also had rights to occupy. So, a bit like the debate that we're currently having with Europe on equivalence, that all this was good stuff to do, and recognizing that there's a lovely role, particularly if you're a small nation, in between the great powers. Many of these Hanseatic cities were stuck inside of larger kingdoms, and these kingdoms were subservient to the Holy Roman Empire. What the Hanseatic cities found was that they could trade beautifully around the empire. And I think as we look around the world today, we've got a bloc in the EU, we've got a bloc in the United States, and we've got a bloc in China, probably a couple other blocs emerging over the next half a century. And this is where Brexit gives a great opportunity to the United Kingdom to trade with all of those. And to do that, we have to keep all of those channels open and be seen to treat all empires fairly, just as what's made London a great financial center has been treating all commerce fairly. We need to treat all empires fairly. And the opportunities that there are quite legion. So, for example, data transfers and data rights. Well, why don't we wholly comply with GDPR and help market that into the United States and, believe it or not, China, where certain consumer privacy laws are moving and things like that. And frankly, what citizen doesn't want GDPR? It's my data, it's my rights, it's my thing. So these are the sorts of areas that we could get into, far beyond trying to play nitpicking little games. Be right there at the center of three empires. You've got to make a lot.
And certainly it's very interesting. We're going to be talking, I'm sure, a little bit more about GDPR. In fact, in a very soon forthcoming episode, because we've got Colin Howard, who's one of the specialists on the topic, is going to be there. And indeed, I have to say, I echo the whole thoughts. Thank you, Chris Pryor-Williard, for that great question about the Hanseatic League. For I was married in the Hanseatic city of Torun in Poland, where I maintain a house to this day, with a beautiful bride who was born actually in the Hanseatic city of Gdańsk and was also therefore moved to Torun. So she was a woman from two Hanseatic cities before she managed to move on towards the city of London, where I met her. So that's a very important message for us all. And I think the Hansa actually is a great message because, let's face it, one of the things that they did in the Hanseatic era was to have guest houses specifically created for the visiting merchants. So therefore in Torun to this day, in fact, it was where we had our wedding reception. There's this beautiful castle, which was the place where you used to come along. And if you were a merchant, you stayed there and then you could do your business over several days and before you departed. So it's a great idea. The Hanseatic League, I think, has a lot to talk about for the future of, well, how we can manage to further discussion. And furthering discussion, we have, I do believe, my masculine intuition tells me we have a gentleman in a tuxedo has joined us this evening, not merely because he's, I do believe, a leading figure in the Chartered Institute of Bankers, but Martin Watkins is going to be hot-footing it to the South African Chamber of Commerce annual dinner, which is happening via Zoom this evening. And of course, a former guest on this show, Sharon Constanson, is going to be hosting that event with Leila Fourie, the chief executive of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, speaking at the event as the after-dinner speaker. But first, adding elegance, we have Martin Watkins with a fascinating long comment and a question. Martin starts, recalling how the city was all about knowing your counterparty, colleagues and competitors. COVID is forcing us to rely on relationships. Does that mean, will this outstanding long finance global indices for global financial centers introduce a heavy weighting for relationships to reflect our new ways of working? So, Michael, is it swipe left and right like Tinder, or are we looking at a longer term relationship here? That's, I think, what Martin Watkins is asking.
Well, the first thing is to recognize that you know your counterparty. So Martin very kindly introduced me to Sharon Constanson at the South African Chamber of Commerce here in London. And we've had a couple of events together, believe it or not, as Sheriff. We showed the Life is Wonderful film, which was it's a documentary about the Rivonia trial. and we showed it together to promote rule of law. So Martin's absolutely right. It is about deep relationships, and he certainly plays that game by making sure that people are connected. So thank you, Martin. But on to the more technical question. The global indices already contain quite a number of measures looking at relationships. So they broadly divide into two camps. We have a whole bunch of instrumental measures about connectivity. So air flights, cities that air flights connect to, blah, 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 blah. That's the first element. The second element is we analyze and categorize cities on a biodiversity measure, which measures how many other cities they're involved with and the depth of that relationship. So if a city is rated by people all over the world, then it will do much better in the index. It's clearly connected with everybody. If a city is doing reasonably well, but say perhaps has only one or two core relationships, then it won't do as well. It's not as well connected. And Martin's absolutely correct. Connectivity is everything. If you're going to run a global financial center, and if you take my earlier point that we are all in it together as finance trying to sell globally, then you need to be cooperating with other centers. It is not a zero-sum game. We all win if the world decides to solve a global problem using finance and markets. And so that connectivity is absolutely crucial. It is measured in two ways very strongly in our index.
Thank you, Martin, for that excellent question. Thank you, Michael, for that excellent answer. And I think you hit the nail on the head, though, because surely isn't the one exciting thing at all points about financial centers the fact that if you have an industrial center, there are only so many cars or washing machines or industrial things people are going to get. So there's a huge substitution effect. However, if you look at financial centers, one of the most exciting things in financial centers is how they've been able to create entirely complementary flows of business. And I mean, I'm thinking of close to London, look at the way Dublin has managed to have an incredible resurgence in areas that were just the fag ends of stuff that London didn't want to do and has turned into billions of dollars worth of business like aircraft leasing and so on. And equally all around the world, it's such an additive business, and that's why cooperation is key.
Well, interesting as well is the people making a business out of non-cooperation or failure to cooperate. I think a really good example has been places like Dubai, Singapore. I would even point out Nur Sultan in Kazakhstan.
Mm-hmm.
I would also equally point to Nanjing in China. And why am I pointing to these cities? Because all of them are making a huge bid to control arbitration, mediation, expert determination, these arbitration courts or alternative dispute resolution areas. And that's a whole thing that falls off of, if you're a financial center bringing people together, you might as well make some money when they divorce. And I think that's an interesting point that these centers have noticed. London has always been so good at it, it kind of never noticed it was a specialty, although there are certainly people out there who promote it for us. And I noticed as well, in particular, in conversations I had just last month with Dublin, they're making a big program. It's a bit like, the accountants, kind of coming around to insolvency. It's the same thing coming around to the arbitration mediation. And that has huge financial implications, both in payments, expert witnesses who are providing their services into it. So when you look at a commercial contract, you try and do the forensic accounting on it, try and figure out who owes who what are the damages, et cetera. These are all very technical areas, and they're all part of financial services.
And of course, the other thing, therefore, that brings us beautifully full circle at that point is that a huge number of those centers that you've mentioned, and particularly in Astana, in Abu Dhabi, which you didn't mention, but also Dubai and around the rest of the world, is, of course, what have they been using? They've actually been, to a large extent, using UK judges, many of whom worked at the Old Bailey under previous sheriffs when they were having their year of stewarding the judges.
And set up zones which are clearly common law zones.
Yeah,
it's the only way really to make it work.
Yeah, and that brings us back to the great conversation we were having about common law with Barney Reynolds just a few episodes ago. You can catch all the back issues on YouTube, so you can go to youtube.com, IPO-VID. In the meanwhile, don't forget to give us a little like, ladies and gentlemen. We would really appreciate it. If you've got a question for Michael Mainelli, Professor, Aldermanic Sheriff of the City of London, he's here right now. We've got just over 15 minutes of the show to run. So we've been talking about computer cities. We've been talking about the intensity of financial issues all around. And it's very interesting because we've heard all of these endless discussions of, actually, it's like Sesame Street, isn't it? C words, colleagues, competitors, Of course, we've had COVID, but one of those is counterparties. And we've got a great question there from John Falk. John, hi, good evening. It's lovely to see you once again. Thank you very much for your question. So, John Falk asks, many countries or cities want to label themselves as financial centres, but what is a realistic number of financial centres?
John, that's a super question. I think that there's some interesting extremes you could play here. One thing that I don't believe people have noticed in our index, which I would highlight, is what's happened is that there's been a sort of a bunching at the top. At the moment, New York is number one. I forget the exact number of points, but then London's about 20 points below New York, 23 or something. And then suddenly you have immediately below London, you have Shanghai, Singapore, and Tokyo on 1,000-point scale, only one apart. So if London falls 4 points, it falls 4 places. That's how tight it is up there. And does that imply perhaps that in fact these centers are, to use the jargon, maxing out? And yet they're all quite successful. So could it be that we could see a plethora of financial centers rise around the world? And in fact, that leads you to sort of the ultimate extreme. Why isn't every place a financial place? And this might be the way that we're headed with finally after, and I know you're probably like me, it's been decades you've been hearing about you'll be up on a mountaintop in Switzerland or down on some tropical island doing all of your financial work, but maybe it's arriving. And perhaps it's the case that we're going to be seeing this rise from 46 to 114 that we've seen over the last 16 years is potentially the way that it's going to go, that everybody who's anybody is going to have an economy, and those economies will generate financial centers, which might in fact be much more financial regions than they are actually some specific geographical location.
And in fact, that's a great point. Thank you very much, John Falk. Excellent question altogether once again, because you talk about regions, and I mean, so many people talk about specific financial centers, but actually when you look at a lot of parts of the world, it's a fusion of several cities together. I mean, everybody has heard of Seoul in South Korea, but I do believe you're going to instantly tell me, but of course, we should be talking about another great city by the coast a couple of 100 miles away.
Yes, Busan, indeed. And in fact, I think that's one of the great things that the Koreans did. I must say we were in discussions with them about it some years ago, but was to deliberately try and position Busan separately from Seoul. So not a lot of people know, technically, the Korean Stock Exchange is in Busan. Yep. More importantly, of course, Busan has really positioned itself as a maritime finance center. And again, people forget, even London has allegedly, there are potentially some 40,000 people working in shipping in London out of a population of 525,000 in the workforce. I personally think the number is a little bit smaller than that, but that's what you're often told. So shipping is a very, very big driver of financial services. And of course, if you look at the growth of financial services, it really correlates so strongly with trade. And a lot of people in financial services think that it's, our great geniuses, it's our rocket scientists, it's all of that. In reality, in 1970, trade was 27% of global GDP, which is a really good measure because that takes account of per capita growth and everything else. And I think from memory, it was 63% of GDP just before lockdown. Although again, the numbers coming in indicate that may not have changed very much. So what we've really seen is financial services growing off of trade, the real economy that we're supposed to be servicing. That's been the solid growth. Been a lot of engineering and other stuff around, I accept. And where I think you get interesting is a place like Busan is doing really, really well. And now backing out from it, it's a bit like do we go to Seoul or not? No, the question is we're going to Korea. Which city do we go to? And it's like having a shop display. So countries that focus on a single center or trying to build a single center deliberately are, in my opinion, missing a big trick. So some of the better areas all around as financial services are federal systems. I mean federal in the structural way. So the United States is a good example. Canada is a good example. But look at China. And China is deliberately fostering a policy of multiple different centers. Chengdu is now on green. Shanghai, we all know, for trading. Beijing for large-scale pensions and asset management. Shenzhen for fintech, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Guangzhou for the automotive industry. Hong Kong functioning as an independent international center. So it's interesting to see. And so you now have this big thing. Which center do we go to in China, as opposed to do we go to China at all because we're going to be stuck in Beijing or one other city? And it's that richness of giving the clients the offering that they want. We are here ultimately to service the client, and the client in this case is firms who are deciding where they want to locate.
Yes, it's fascinating altogether, that whole federal nature that we're seeing in places like China. And also, actually, if you look even closer to the UK, if you look at the Emirates, where the UAE has divided quite significantly between its financial centres, many of them taking on a common law English role, giving various judges the opportunity to see out their years in some sunny climes. But also, as well as that sunny climate, they've been trying to do different products as they go along. Speaking of the timing of the clock, ladies and gentlemen, we have 10 minutes to run in this show. If you have a question for Professor Alderman Michael Mainelli, speak now or forever hold your peace, or at least hold your peace for certainly many months, because while we'd love to have him back on the show, I fear sooner or later people are going to be allowed out under COVID, and I suspect Michael will actually be doing a bit of unsustainable travel in the near future, because there's only so many people he can talk to from Zoom from his home office during the course of time. Now, if we look at what's going on at the moment, we've got some fascinating movements. And actually, I'm thinking of Chris Pryor-Williard here, because he's probably having apoplexy. He's screaming right now, because you mentioned maritime. And Busan absolutely built itself on maritime finance. And you mentioned the 40,000 people in the City of London. But yet, when we look at the commoditization of what's going on with a lot of things to do with transit and transport, it's kind of weird to me, because really the container ship revolutionized transport, but we haven't really revolutionized the financing of transport. And it's interesting to see that the initiatives at the moment in that regard are all in the US, the New York Shipping Exchange, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a pity that we're not seeing more of that sort of innovation coming in London. Not wanting you to ask you that specifically, but do you think there's an issue generally with innovation in the City of London?
Oh, that's a tough call. I think there's an issue with innovation in Europe, and therefore, and I'm not saying the EU, in Europe, and I think the UK has an innovation problem to boot. Innovation. I used to run about 40% of UK R&D as a director of DERA, so I know a fair chunk about managing large groups of scientists and innovation. And one of the problems is you find that innovation tends to result from two things. A lovely book by Bill Janeway. Two things are war and bubbles. When your back's to the wall, the politicians will throw everything at it, because if they lose the war, they're going to be back to the wall and shot. So as far as they're concerned, anything is justified. And a good example of this is, I think Britain was running at roughly 70% of the economy in 1945 was the government, because it was an all-out effort to win. Bubbles, though, are often unremarked, and bubbles are typically areas where money is spent and wasted. And so you see the remnants of the dot-com bubble, you see the remnants of financial bubbles of all form. Something often good comes out of it, but disproportionate amounts of input went into it. So if you want innovation, those are your two drivers, bluntly. It almost makes sense, because if you knew where the innovation was going to come from, you'd have a process and it'd be all very straightforward. You'd be very efficient about it. So you can't be efficient about innovation. And if you're not going to be efficient about innovation, but you're going to make money from it, you have to be a center where people bring resources and bring energy, and that's wasted, but the residual benefits you. And I think London for the last 4 years hasn't been as shining as it used to be. People used to love to come to London. I mean, one of the saddest things, if you look across the history of London over a millennia or two, is it's a place people went to die. Believe it or not, it was people migrating from rural regions to London. London was a net death center. Not enough people were born locally to support the population, and that really ran all the way up until the 20th century. And it's the same thing with innovation. If you're going to run an innovation center, there's going to be a lot of wastage. You don't want to be funding that. You want people from outside bringing that in and funding that. And that's not just cash, that's lives, that's ambitions. For every fintech entrepreneur that's very successful and on television in a black turtleneck and, wearing the headphone, there are another 30, 40, 50, 90, 100, 200 out there who went bust, and they go home. So you've got to think about it that way. And to do all of that, you need to have competition. That's the thing that puts your neck on the line. And I do think in Europe, we've been very, very cozy. As you go to the Far East, you see a differentiated competition. So a lot of your listeners would say, well, it doesn't sound like there's much competition in China because you've got really two major payment platforms. But of course, you can also see what the government's doing, which is closing those down and saying, you've become a utility now. So there's a difference between a utility that's grown, an innovative firm that's grown and become a utility, and innovation. And I would hope here in the UK, post-Brexit, now that we're sort of shaking ourselves off, we're beginning to realize we have to compete. And I'm expecting to see a lot of innovation, but I would like to have some of that energy for that innovation brought here rather than us trying to manufacture it locally.
Very interesting. So the idea of importing innovation as much as we're trying to see the innovation coming from overseas. And certainly you mentioned that excellent Bill Janaway book, which was, I think, Doing Capitalism in the Innovation Economy, Market Speculation in the State. Yeah, it's a really good, a really inspiring read altogether, actually, Janaway. It's everything you need to know about innovation in one handy tome. Admittedly, it's a sort of handy tome that if you dropped it on the foot, you probably would have possibly grounds for damages in the near course. Maybe better in an ebook, ladies and gentlemen. Now we've got one. I think we've got an extra comment which has just been coming through. Oh no, we're actually lifting the cover of the book for you, Doing Capitalism in the Innovation Economy, Market Speculation in the State. Let me also mention, actually, because I do believe I can see it over your shoulder, The Price of Fish, a splendid tome by Professor Michael Mainelli as well, which I could see that lovely little fishy look. So yes, give that a wave. That was your award-winning book from a few years ago.
Yeah, we were trying to weave together really, how did you address wicked problems, and weaving together choice, economics, evolution, and systems theory, and trying to apply it. And the kind of theme of fish really came because I had done a lot of work helping to set up the Marine Stewardship Council with my colleague Ian Harris, and we just thought fish made a really good example of where people are getting it wrong. If markets work so well, why are we overfishing constantly, and why are fish becoming increasingly endangered? And so the book explores where markets set up improperly don't work and how to restructure them to set them up to do more social good.
And on that point of markets, actually, something Chris Pryor-Williard echoes something that I think as well, which is, my word is my bond, mem dictamus mem pactum, could cultivate the type of competition that codified regulation could not touch. Yeah.
Well, Chris is on such a good point here. And I would refer folks here to an interesting paper that came out, I believe, about 8 years ago in Harvard Business Review by Henderson and Romana. They use the word capitalism, but I don't like the word capitalism. I like the word, free market, or the phrase free markets. I'm not a capitalist per se, but I do believe in competition in markets. And what they point out is that managers have a moral obligation to the markets that they're on, a bit like the point that I made earlier. We have an obligation to police our own markets. So if I see you doing something that's not right for the customer, I should call you out because you are queering my market. And I, if I'm doing it, should be called out by you. And under the old system, when you had more players competing, say 40 or 50 investment banks when I began in the city, they would say who are the bad uns. And now there's so few that nobody's really concerned with calling anyone out. And if you call them out and you're in a mid-level or senior, not too senior management position, you won't have another job, which is where the whistleblowers are constantly making the refrain. By doing the right thing, they lose their livelihood, and that's hardly right. And so we wind up with this horrible, brittle regulatory structure, when I do believe that a much more mutual, bring back the old mutuals, is really what that was about.
Yes, absolutely. And an excellent comment that you just made there. We have an obligation to police our market. I think that's a very important thing to be able to say, because that sort of codifies what's going on. And certainly I think Chris is on a great point here, because when we got into, and you've made the point about the self-regulatory organizations, which actually did a great job. When you suddenly have a monolithic regulator, I'm not sure that everything gets anything other than coddled in probably often for the best possible intentions, but a degree of red tape and misunderstanding, and oligopolies grow.
I mean, private eye constantly refers to the FCA as a, fundamentally supine authority, under the old FSA. Yeah. But, as somebody, I mean, my firm reported LIBOR shenanigans in 2007, but it didn't break to 2012. In fact, when it broke in 2012, it was quite interesting. I got called up by, I think it was Business Week in America. Oh, you're the guy who discovered LIBOR, because they wanted somebody. And I said, no, it wasn't me, actually. I'd found out subsequently a Frenchman by the name of Jean-Francois Bourgie had actually reported it in great depth, far greater than I, making a few comments and showing a few sheets, about a year before us, in fact. So they ran an article about the man who discovered LIBOR, and they showed Jean-Francois, quite rightly, which made me feel good as well, in a sad way, because the poor fellow died a week after he was on the cover of Business Week. So at least he went knowing that he'd finally been recognized. But why should something like that, which was so egregious, so obvious, anybody who'd worked in a fixed income area knew what was going on. In fact, they hired each other, and then suddenly nobody was to blame, nobody knew it. That took over 5 years. In fact, in the case of the United Kingdom, the regulators really would have only did anything because the US had called them out when the SEC started to do prosecutions. So we've got to sharpen up here, and the regulators are probably at their limit. And so I think Chris is right. Much more of this SRO, setting up mutual organizations and recognizing our moral obligation to society, is where we're going to have to go if we want to have an industry that isn't state-run.
So, Michael, we're into our absolute final question. I know that Chris Messina, it's been an evening of many insightful Chris's this evening, Prior Williard and Messina. Chris Messina is asking what's the biggest headache the city faces due to Brexit. But actually, let me open that up a bit, because you've only got one question to answer. What's the biggest headache, or what's the biggest opportunity you're seeing coming up?
Well, I think the biggest headache that the city faces due to Brexit is getting everybody in the nation to move. It's a national movement. And I think some of the dysfunctionality in the government might be being shaken out. Confidence is growing given the vaccination program. All this is fairly transient. I should be talking about much longer term trends than that. But that's probably the biggest headache. I think the biggest opportunity the city has is, to refer to the other Chris, Prior Williard, is actually this Hanseatic element. If we could develop a clear strategy with Europe, the United States, and China, where they all see us as a trusted central third party for their dealings, that London is a place that you can go to get things done, I think the city has got the best opportunity of all. Now, that's not just on financial regulation. As I mentioned earlier, it's also data regulation. It's also on standards, for example, to do with ESG. There are a whole bunch of areas around finance that will compete. The biggest example I can give you, and it's one that I have said to people, for example, in China, very senior Chinese individuals, I've never seen anybody do a financial deal in Beijing or Shanghai where there wasn't a domestic component. I've said this to senior Americans. I've never seen anybody do a deal in New York. Would you want to do a deal in New York if you didn't have a domestic component? Basically, you'd be paying, your overnight fees, and then 50 lawyers' hotel rooms as well. So that's terrible. But I have seen people do deals in London where there was no domestic UK component. I've seen it in Singapore, and I think that's one of the defining factors there, that ultimately these large centralized groups wind up doing jobs for the boys and the girls, the Made in America, or the, You're Only Chinese. And Britain has an opportunity to be that global coffee house where people come because they will be treated fairly. And I think the biggest sign of success in London would be this rising proportion of people saying, I had to do a deal and I went to London. Oh, was that because you had a business in Oxford or Edinburgh? No, it was just the right place to do the deal. We had nothing in the UK. That to me would be a great sign of success.
Michael Mainelli, thank you very much for what has been a sensational show this evening. It's very interesting because you're always so statistically data rich, which is fabulous altogether, because I noticed the fact that the trend in business travel, that was particularly pointed, going down by 8% in Scandinavia in 2019, even before we had any degree of COVID crisis. That was quite intriguing altogether. Fascinating to see also some of the numbers you were throwing out. I mean, about the leverage of the UK banks in 2007, 2008. UK banks leveraged at 42 to 1. So there you go. 42, the ultimate answer to life, the universe, and bankruptcy. Quite clearly was the only thing that we could manage to draw from that. But you hit the nail on the head over the oligopoly of issues, which are certainly things that need to be addressed in the City of London and other financial centres, the openness towards a sustainable city and moving beyond. And in fact, you hit upon a wonderful topic, the Hansa. Because the thing about the Hansa is, of course, as you mentioned, innovation flowed from it. And the Hansa enabled a wealthy merchant, Mr. Kopernik, to have a son who ultimately became, of course, one of the world's most famous economists, military tacticians, men of the church. And he wasn't such a bad hand at astronomy either, as many people now know, because it's thanks to him that we can largely work out when Easter is. So with those sorts of possible things, perhaps we're on the cusp of a Copernican revolution for the sustainable city. And at the same point in time, I think it's fascinating that we're moving towards not just a sustainable city and beyond, but the opportunity for the global coffee house to take center stage, as you're suggesting, Michael. To all those who have given us questions and comments this evening, last but by no means least, Michelle de Beer, another excellent contribution from South Africa. Thank you very much. Not sure if you're going to the South African Chamber of Commerce's virtual dinner this evening, as is Martin Watkins, I do know, and Sharon Constanson. We also wish to thank you very much, Chris Messina, Chris Pryor-Williard. Great questions from all of you. It was super to hear from John Falk once again and Marianne Madeira. Coming up next week, innovation, data, GDPR, and the sovereign individual. What could be more prescient after what Professor Mainelli has been telling us this evening, ladies and gentlemen? That's coming up with Colin Howard's 2 weeks' time. Actually, no, sorry, 3 weeks' time, because we're going to be taking a week off for Easter, distributing blockchain globally with Sandra Rowe. I'm looking forward to it all. Ladies and gentlemen, I would urge you, even if you're in lockdown, to consider your home part of the global coffee house movement. Head towards it, enjoy a suitable beverage of choice. If you're at the South African Chamber of Commerce dinner, have a great one. Professor Michael Mainelli, thank you very much. And as always, we wish all great success to the City of London and all the world's great financial centres. My name is Patrick L. Young. Thank you for watching and have a great evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Patrick.